The city breathed cold through its glass bones and concrete arteries. A restless machine pulsing under the weight of a history it never wanted to remember. Sirens howled like warnings that came too late. Neon signs blinked lies in every color. And, beneath the towering skyline, the people moved with eyes cast downward, not out of shame, but survival. At the corner of 53rd and Monroe, beneath a crumbling street lamp that flickered like a broken promise, walked a man whose presence didn't turn heads. Not anymore. He was tall, but slightly stooped, dressed in a simple brown coat and worn leather shoes that had seen too many winters. His gait was slow, careful, each step measured like a final argument in a closing statement. His name was Joseph Lowell, though no one called him that anymore. Not the drivers who honked as he crossed the street a moment too late, not the barista who forgot his order every morning, not the neighbors who mistook his silence for distance. They didn't know that, 30 years ago, his voice could silence a courtroom and send corrupt men to prison with nothing but a gaze. He had once worn the black robe of federal judgment, a symbol feared and revered, but now it hung in a dusty closet while the world forgot the man who had carried it. And on this particular Wednesday morning, as the sky grew darker instead of lighter, Joseph reached the crosswalk too late. The light blinked red. A police cruiser idled nearby. Its engine growled low, like something hungry. Inside, a young white officer chewed gum and narrowed his eyes. Joseph didn't see the eyes. He just walked, cane in hand, not fast enough, not slow enough to be safe, just enough to be noticed by the wrong man on the wrong day. The officer opened the door. Boots hit asphalt. The badge on his chest gleamed. "Hey!" the voice barked behind him, sharp and preemptive, the kind of tone that didn't wait for guilt to be proven. Joseph turned. The officer stepped closer. "Didn't see the light? You blind, old man?" The words cut, not just because of the disrespect, but because the question was close to truth. Joseph's vision had been slipping, just like everything else. "I saw it," Joseph answered, his voice graveled but dignified. "I made it across." The officer's face twisted, like a child told no. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." Joseph froze, heart skipping, not at the threat, but at the phrase, "you people." He'd heard it behind closed doors, in courtrooms dressed as policy, in whispers at country clubs, and on golf courses where judges were never supposed to go. He had spent decades dismantling systems built on those two words, and now they stood before him, wearing a uniform. The officer stepped forward. "What's your name?" Joseph didn't answer. His silence was a wall, but the wrong kind. The officer shoved him. Joseph's balance faltered, cane slipping. His glasses, thin, gold-rimmed, older than the man in uniform, flew from his face, bounced once on the concrete, and shattered beneath a boot. The crunch was loud, final. The world turned into smears. "You don't walk away from me," the officer growled. Joseph, breath caught, stayed on one knee. He could feel eyes on him. People on the sidewalk, frozen, unsure whether to help or to look away. That silence, that crowd of blinking faces was louder than the cop's voice. They didn't know who he was. The city didn't know who it had just shoved to the ground. And the man in blue, he had no idea what line he had crossed. Not yet. The silence that followed the crunch of Joseph's glasses was not empty. It was thick, suffocating. A silence that vibrated with cowardice, with tension, with the cold breath of a city that had grown numb to cruelty. The officer stood above him, jaw clenched, fingers twitching by the holster on his belt, posture puffed with the artificial confidence that comes when no one dares to challenge you. Joseph didn't move at first. The ground beneath his palms felt strangely warm, almost alive, and he could hear the cars humming past, the impatient honks, the rhythm of a city that had decided long ago that black pain was just background noise. He reached for what remained of his glasses, now a twisted piece of gold wire and cracked lenses. The officer stepped back and let out a small, humorless laugh. "What, no apology?" he asked, loud enough for the small crowd that had gathered. "No thank you for keeping the streets safe, sir?" His tone wasn't angry. It was performative, meant for those watching, meant to rewrite what they'd just seen into something palatable, something that would fit neatly into a report. Joseph rose slowly, every joint in protest, and stood without speaking. His eyes, now blurred and swimming, found the vague shapes of two teenagers across the street recording with their phones, half hidden behind a bus shelter. The officer noticed too. His face changed, flickered with the awareness that something might not go his way, but pride kept him from backing down. "You got ID?" he barked. "You're loitering, impeding traffic." Joseph blinked through the blur, through a fog of anger he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I was crossing the street," he said, voice low, calm, the kind of calm that frightens small men. "You assaulted me." "Oh, now you're the victim," the officer snapped, stepping forward again. Typical, always playing the card. "You people think rules don't mean you." Those words again, "you people," that venomous little phrase that turns skin into a target and dignity into defiance. The crowd grew. More phones appeared. One woman called out, "Leave him alone," but didn't move closer. The cop turned slightly, scowled at her, then looked back at Joseph, who still hadn't looked away. "You gonna tell me your name, old man?" The way he said old man made it sound like worthless. Joseph finally spoke, each word deliberate, cut from steel. "You don't deserve my name." The officer's face twisted. That was the moment when pride and racism and unchecked power collided in one violent surge. He grabbed Joseph by the collar, yanked him toward the hood of the cruiser, and slammed him against it. "Put your hands behind your back," he barked, eyes wide with the rush of control. Joseph didn't resist, didn't struggle, but the force of the impact knocked the wind from his lungs and his body sagged slightly. Somewhere in the crowd, someone shouted, "He's an old man." Another voice, "He didn't do anything." But none of them stepped forward. None of them knew who he was. The cuffs clicked. Cold metal bit into thin wrists. He had sentenced murderers, dismantled cartels, authored opinions quoted by law schools across the country. But today, on this corner, he was just another old black man on the wrong side of a badge. The officer opened the back door of the cruiser and shoved him inside. Joseph's head hit the doorframe. His cane was left lying in the street, and as the cruiser pulled away, tires hissing over the crosswalk paint, the people dispersed like smoke, retreating into their routines, their silence echoing louder than any siren. The city had seen this before, and the city had learned to look away. The back seat of the cruiser was stiff, slick with dried sweat and dust, and smelled like fear. Layers of it, baked into the plastic from years of people like Joseph being dragged through a system designed to break them before it ever judged them. The handcuffs cut deeper with every bump in the road, and his wrists, thin with age but strong from decades of quiet resistance, pulsed with pain that was more than physical. The officer, his name still unknown, his badge number unreadable from where Joseph sat, glanced into the rearview mirror every few seconds, not to check on his prisoner, but to make sure he still controlled the narrative. "You think you can just ignore orders and walk around like you own the place," he muttered, not loudly, but with that certain edge, that simmering contempt that didn't need volume to wound. "People like you always think you're above the rules." Joseph didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence itself was a blade, too sharp for the officer to handle. "Not so tough now, huh?" the cop said with a forced laugh, tapping the steering wheel. "Not when you're sitting back there like everybody else who thinks they're special." Joseph's hands flexed slowly behind him. The skin around the cuffs was raw now. His shoulders ached, but he didn't shift, didn't ask for relief. He had once cross-examined men who had killed without blinking, had stared down cartel leaders who threatened to gut his family, had ruled against billion-dollar corporations with nothing more than a stroke of a pen. And yet now, he was being driven like a criminal, humiliated not for what he'd done, but for what he looked like. The precinct was a low-slung building with grime-blackened walls and flickering security lights that buzzed like insects on their last breath. As the cruiser pulled up, Joseph braced himself. Not for pain, for the ritual. He had seen it from the other side of the bench 1,000 times. The rough arm yank, the watch your step that always came a second too late. The walk of shame into a holding cell already stained by the breath of too many stories that no one cared to listen to. The officer opened the door with a grin, as if he were proud of his prize. "Let's go, Judge Judy." The joke wasn't funny. It wasn't meant to be. It was an insult dressed up like a laugh. Lazy, familiar, and steeped in a mockery that said, "You're not who you think you are. You're just another one of them." Joseph stepped out slowly. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself. No reaction. No complaint. The cop grabbed his arm anyway, harder than necessary, and led him through the side door, away from the main entrance, away from the eyes of the public. The booking officer barely looked up. "Loitering, obstruction, non-compliance," the arresting officer said, tossing a clipboard onto the counter like he was ordering takeout. The man behind the desk grunted. "Name?" Joseph hesitated. His tongue was dry. His lips were cracked. For a moment he considered saying it. Judge Joseph C. Lowell, appointed by President Warren, presided over 217 federal cases, decorated for judicial service, retired with honors. But instead, he said nothing, just looked up, the remnants of his broken glasses still tucked into his coat pocket, and let the silence speak. The booking officer sighed, not even curious. "Fine, John Doe." They took his fingerprints, rough, quick, as if he were just another file in a stack that didn't matter. They didn't recognize him. They didn't care. He was old, black, and arrested. That was enough. That was the story. They took his shoes. They took his belt. They took his watch, a gift from his wife, now dead, the back engraved with her handwriting. Always, no matter what. They placed him in a holding cell no bigger than a closet, with a cold bench and walls the color of spit. The air inside was damp and heavy. Time passed without sound, without clocks, without identity. In the next cell over, a younger man, also black, sat watching him. "They rough you up too?" he asked, voice low. Joseph didn't answer. The man studied him a little longer. "You look like you used to matter." Joseph finally turned his head, eyes unfocused but sharp in tone. "I did." The younger man nodded. "Not here, you don't." And Joseph understood. He wasn't a judge here, not in this room, not in this skin, not in a world where the weight of decades of service could be crushed by the boot of a man too blind to see the robe under the coat. The sound of keys rattling came hours later. A voice called out his placeholder name. "John Doe, you're free to go." No explanation, no paperwork, no apology. Just a plastic bag with his belongings. His glasses, still broken. His cane, snapped at the handle. As he stepped back into the daylight, Joseph felt the sun touch his face like it hadn't in years. Not warm, not gentle, just real. And he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Let's take a brief pause. If you're still listening, drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching or listening from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life or in your community? We'd love to hear your experience. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, we continue. The walk from the precinct to the bus stop was short in distance but long in wait. Joseph Lowell moved slowly, holding the torn remains of his cane like a crutch of memory more than support, each step echoing humiliation deeper than bone. His shoes scraped the pavement, socks damp from a puddle no one warned him about, and his broken glasses sat crookedly in his breast pocket, like a wound that refused to scab over. No one offered help. No one made eye contact. Just another frail black man exiting a building where dignity went to die. A patrol cruiser idled nearby as he passed. The officer inside looked up briefly, then looked away. To him, Joseph was already filed away under processed and forgotten. Back inside that same precinct, Officer Darren M. Halvers was laughing. Not belly laughing, but the kind of smug chuckle shared between uniforms when they believed the world outside couldn't hear them. "He looked like he thought he was somebody," Halvers said, leaning back in a cracked chair in the break room. "Real classy. Until he hit the hood of my car like a sack of laundry." The other two officers grinned. One of them tossed a paper cup into the trash. Another day, another mouthy old man. "You check his record?" Halvers shook his head. "Didn't need to. You could tell. That attitude? Definitely been through before. They all act like that when they think they're special." The racism wasn't loud. It didn't come with slurs or shouting. It came in familiarity, in the way their voices lowered into private frequencies of contempt, in the comfort with which they dehumanized him, in the casual way they referred to them. He had that look, one officer added, like he grew up thinking the law would protect him. You know the type. Think just 'cause they went to some college they're better than us. Halvers smirked. Well, the ground reminded him. Bet he won't be skipping lights again. The room filled with laughter. No one mentioned the cameras. No one asked if the arrest had been legal. And no one, not one man in blue, had even thought to check his name. In another wing of the building, the incident report was being typed up. The officer in charge of documentation barely skimmed Halver's statement. Suspect ignored verbal commands, attempted to evade. Physical resistance minimal. Officer employed proportional force. No visible injury. Suspect refused to identify himself. Released without charge. It was clean, efficient, vague enough to survive scrutiny, neat enough to vanish in a drawer. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a quiet living room filled with sunlight and framed photographs of another life, a retired clerk from the federal court system turned on her television. Her name was Bernice Holden. She hadn't seen Joseph Lowell in years, not since his retirement ceremony where he'd spoken softly about justice and legacy. His wife still alive then, holding his hand like a vow. But she recognized him instantly on the shaky video that was beginning to go viral online, captured by one of the teenagers across the street, posted with the title, "Cop slams elderly man for crossing the street." The footage wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Joseph standing, a young officer shouting, the shove, the fall, the glasses breaking, the cuffs, the limp walk. Bernice dropped her tea. She watched the clip again and again. She picked up her phone and called someone who hadn't heard that name in years. "It's Judge Lowell," she whispered. They arrested Judge Lowell. Across the city, in the local newsrooms where red tickers blinked in silence and interns watched social media feeds like oracles reading bone, something shifted. A name appeared in the comments beneath the video. "Is that the Joseph Lowell, former federal judge?" Another user replied, "No way. That man put away half the city's gang network in the 90s. The footage spread faster. It was no longer a video of an anonymous black elder being abused by the state. It was now the state turning on its own. And yet the precinct still had no idea. Because when Officer Halvers shoved him to the ground, he didn't see a judge. He didn't see a man. He saw what the uniform trained him to see. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who could be bent until they broke. Someone who wouldn't fight back. But this time, someone had pressed record. And this time, someone remembered his name. The story of Joseph Lowell, former federal judge, had become more than just a viral video. It was a crack in the facade of a city that had long prided itself on its progressiveness, its so-called justice, its shiny streets and gleaming skyscrapers. But beneath it all, the same old systems of power and oppression lingered, festering quietly, waiting for the right moment to break free and show their true face. Joseph sat in his modest apartment, still processing what had happened. His hand trembled slightly as he held a cup of lukewarm coffee. The faint image of his own reflection in the dark liquid serving as a painful reminder of the fractured man he had become. The bruises on his chest were beginning to heal, but the wounds on his dignity had only deepened. The pain was no longer physical. It was the weight of a lifetime of service, a lifetime of upholding the law, of being a man who had fought for justice, now being trampled by the very system he had once believed in. He hadn't heard from the police, not officially. There had been no apology, no acknowledgement of the wrongful arrest. Not that he had expected one, but what had truly unsettled him was how easily he had been discarded, like an old pair of shoes, or a forgotten piece of history. In the eyes of the officer who had shoved him to the ground, he was no different from the nameless faces who filled the jails, the faces that had been pushed aside and ignored for decades. The world outside his window buzzed with the usual noise of the city. But inside, there was a heaviness that made it all seem distant, disconnected. The police, the protesters, the people on the street, they were all part of the same narrative, but none of them understood the deeper story. Not the way Joseph did, not the way someone who had spent a lifetime in the corridors of power, who had seen how the law was manipulated and twisted to serve the few, could understand. Joseph had spent his youth in the segregated South, where every step was measured against the weight of racial hatred, where every glance could be a judgment and every word could be an attack. He had fought tooth and nail to escape that life, to prove that black people could rise above the poison that the world had poured into their veins. And for a while, it had worked. He had become a judge. He had sat in the seat of power, made decisions that had changed lives, sent men and women to prison, and freed others. He had been part of the system, part of the very thing that now held him captive. But no matter how high he had climbed, no matter how many walls he had torn down, the world had always reminded him of who he was. And now, in the face of a young officer's casual cruelty, he had been reduced to nothing more than a forgotten name. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Bernice, the retired clerk who had recognized him in the video. "Joseph, have you seen it?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "The news is all over it." "I've seen it," Joseph replied, his voice strained. "I saw everything." "I can't believe they did that to you," Bernice said softly, the pain in her voice clear. "You've done so much for this city. You've given your life to it, and this is how they repay you." Joseph leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "It's not just about me, Bernice. It's about the whole system. It's about what they think of us, what they've always thought of us." "You mean them," she said, her voice hardening. "The ones who think the rules don't apply to them. The ones who think the world owes them something. The ones who think a black man doesn't have a place in their world unless they can control him." Joseph was silent for a long moment. He had been living in that world for so long, had seen the mechanisms that powered it, the systems that kept it running. But now, looking back on everything, he wondered if it had all been for nothing. What good was it to fight for justice when the world had already decided you didn't deserve it? "I'm not going to let it slide," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let them do this to me and just walk away like it's nothing." "I know you won't," Bernice said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "But Joseph, you've got to be careful. This is bigger than one cop. This is about everything that's broken. And you're not alone in this fight. People are watching." Joseph stood and walked to the window, looking out at the streets below. The protests were growing in size. He could hear the chants, the shouts of people demanding justice. It was a strange thing, watching it from the other side, knowing that his name had become a symbol, that the city he had spent so many years serving was now asking for answers. But there was something about the way the world was changing that made him feel both hopeful and afraid. Hopeful that things might finally shift, that the power structure that had kept people like him in their place might finally be challenged. Afraid because he knew how the system responded when it was threatened. He had been part of the system for so long, and now he was its target. As the protests continued to grow, so did the media attention. Joseph's name was on the front page of newspapers, his face plastered across TV screens. But even as his story spread, there were those who were determined to twist it, to turn it into something else, something more controllable. The cop who had assaulted him was already spinning a new narrative, one in which Joseph had been the aggressor, the one who had provoked the situation. The police department was issuing statements, trying to paint the picture that it was just an unfortunate incident, that the officer had acted in the heat of the moment, and that everything was under control. But the public wasn't buying it. The video had spread too far, too fast. People were demanding accountability, and for once, the voices of the powerless were being heard. Joseph knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, about a system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. It wasn't just one cop on one street corner. It was the entire machinery of racism and oppression that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, invisible to those who had never been forced to face it. But Joseph had faced it. He had faced it his whole life. And now, with his name out in the open, with the world watching, he had to decide what to do next. He had spent so many years on the bench, making decisions for others. But now it was his turn. The choice was his. He could retreat into the silence he had known for so long, or he could stand up and fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of the system. And for the first time, in a long time, Joseph knew what he had to do. He wasn't done yet. The morning after the video of Joseph Lowell's arrest hit the internet, the city felt different. There was an electric charge in the air, the kind that hinted at something about to crack. People were talking. The headlines had splashed across every news outlet. The faces of Joseph Lowell, the former federal judge who had been shoved, humiliated, and treated like an everyday criminal, were plastered everywhere. But beyond the sensationalism, beneath the outrage, something had shifted. People began to see him not just as a victim of one officer's brutality, but as a symbol of something much larger. The protests had started small, just a few dozen voices raised in defiance, demanding justice for a man most didn't even recognize. But as the day wore on, they began to swell, reaching hundreds, then thousands, spilling into the streets and filling the public square outside the police station where Joseph had been processed. Signs reading, "Justice for Joseph" and "End Police Brutality" dotted the crowds, many of them handwritten, sharp with emotion. A few said, "We see you" in bold letters. The message aimed at those in power, and specifically at those who thought a man like Joseph, older, black, and seemingly out of place in the hustle of modern life, had no value. Inside Joseph's apartment, the silence felt like a weight he couldn't shake off. His mind ran through 1,000 different thoughts, each one louder than the last. Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't I see this coming? Bernice had called earlier that morning, her voice low and urgent. "Joseph, the news. It's everywhere. People are watching. People are listening. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about something bigger." But he wasn't sure if the enormity of it all had sunk in yet. The young officer's hand had been just the beginning. The system, this whole twisted machine, had buried too many people for too long, and now it was being exposed. But would it even matter? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Joseph glanced toward the hallway, then moved toward the door, wondering who it could be. When he opened it, he was met by a familiar face, one of the reporters who had been at the scene, the one who had asked questions when no one else would. "Mr. Lowell?" the young woman asked, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Mara Smith from Channel 6. Can we speak with you about what happened?" Joseph didn't have the energy for another interview. But something in the reporter's eyes, something that told him she wasn't just here for the story, made him pause. "I'm not sure what you expect to get from me," Joseph said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting for years, only to find himself broken in a way he hadn't expected. Mara stepped closer, her camera crew hanging back a few paces. "We're not here to sensationalize. People need to hear your story. They need to hear about what happened to you, yes, but they also need to hear about who you are, the man behind this, because they need to understand that this isn't just about one officer. This is about a whole system that doesn't work for people like you, and people like me, people like all of us." Joseph's face tightened, but he stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. He wasn't sure what would come from this conversation, but for the first time, he felt the weight of what was happening, what could happen, pressing on him, and it terrified him. Mara sat on the edge of his couch, setting up her microphone as the camera crew prepared their shots. Joseph sank into the armchair opposite her. His posture slumped, though his gaze never wavered. She began with a question that seemed so simple, so basic, that it almost made him flinch. "Mr. Lowell, for those who may not know you, can you tell us who you are?" The question hung in the air. Joseph knew it was meant to humanize him, to remind the audience that he wasn't just another black man in the system, that he was more than just the headline. But in the moment, the question felt like a mockery, a desperate attempt to put a man back into a box that would fit the narrative. He looked at her, weighing his words. "I'm a man who gave decades of my life to a system I thought I could trust," Joseph said, his voice steady but heavy with the gravity of it all. "I served as a judge for more than 30 years. I sentenced people. I freed people. I tried to make sure the law worked for all. But what happens when the law isn't what you thought it was? What happens when the very system you trusted doesn't just fail you, it destroys you?" Mara's eyes softened, but she didn't look away. She knew what he was saying. She knew that behind every word was a history of struggle. The struggle of a black man who had fought the battle his entire life, only to be ground down into the same dust that had buried so many others. "Do you think that's what happened to you?" Mara asked, her voice small now, as if she understood the magnitude of the question. "Do you think the system failed you?" Joseph's eyes clouded for a moment, and he blinked, as though seeing the years of his life flash before him. The rulings, the cases, the victories. And yet, here he was, a forgotten name, a man stripped of his identity by an officer who had no idea who he was, a man whose career had once been the embodiment of justice, now reduced to nothing but a broken pair of glasses and a criminal record for loitering. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think it failed me. And I think it fails everyone who isn't part of its perfect image. I was supposed to be safe. I was supposed to be above this. But I wasn't. And that tells me everything I need to know." Mara nodded, but she didn't respond immediately. She let the silence linger, let it sink in. The weight of his words hung between them, filling the space like an unspoken truth. The truth that, for all his accolades, for all his victories, Joseph Lowell was no different from anyone else when faced with the brutality of a system built on inequality. He was just another black man in a city that couldn't see past his skin. After a long pause, Mara asked, "So, what now, Mr. Lowell? What happens next?" Joseph looked at her. He had been asking himself the same question for hours, for days. The truth was, he didn't know, but there was a fire inside him now. Something burning that hadn't been there before. He had spent so much time behind a bench, so much time following the rules, that he had forgotten the fight wasn't just about making decisions. It was about being heard. "We fight," Joseph said. "We fight because we're all in this together. We fight because the system doesn't get to decide who we are. And if I have to remind them who I am, who we are, then I will." Mara set her microphone down as the camera crew moved back. For a moment, Joseph saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in the eyes of the protesters on the street, the same fire that had kept him going for so long, even when the world seemed intent on making him disappear. The fight had just begun. The protests were no longer a passing wave, they had become a storm. The streets, once filled with the mundane hum of city life, were now lined with the chants of thousands. It wasn't just about Joseph Lowell anymore. The spark that had been ignited by the video of his brutal treatment had grown into something more powerful. It was no longer just one man's fight for justice. It was the fight of an entire community, of an entire city, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Dignity, respect, and the right to be heard. The marches, the signs, the speeches, they all carried the same message. Enough. Joseph watched from his apartment as the city outside became a battlefield. News vans parked on every corner, reporters thrusting microphones in front of faces that had never spoken their truths out loud. The cameras captured the faces of the young and the old, black and white, Asian and Latinx, all standing side by side. They stood for him, but they also stood for themselves. It was the first time in a long time that Joseph felt the weight of his own history. His entire career, his fight for equality, all of it had led him here. And still, he had never felt so powerless. In the courtroom, things were moving quickly. The case against Officer Darren Halvers had already begun to take shape, but the system that Joseph had once sworn to uphold was now grinding against him. In an ironic twist, it was the very institution he had served for decades that seemed bent on burying the truth beneath layers of bureaucracy. A report was filed by the police department. Halvers had acted within the confines of his training and responded to a hostile individual who failed to comply with lawful orders. It was the same old story, the one that had been used to justify the brutality of police officers since the beginning of time. The system was rigged, and everyone involved knew it. Yet the video was undeniable. People had seen it. They had witnessed the assault, the glass that shattered under Halver's boot, the way Joseph was pushed down like an animal, treated like he didn't matter, like he wasn't human. But Joseph knew that the video alone wasn't going to change anything. It wasn't going to be enough. The fight was going to be much harder than that. Joseph sat in his apartment, listening to the murmurs from the street below, a part of him wanting to join them, to walk down and stand with the crowd that had turned out to demand justice. But his body felt heavy, too heavy. He could feel the age in his bones, the weight of years spent in a system that had taken everything from him, from his community, and turned it into a game of power and control. Even now, when he had nothing left, when the world had decided he was nothing more than a shattered old man, he felt the pull of his duty. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and he couldn't stop now. Not when he had been broken, not when so many others had been broken too. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He rose slowly, stiffly, and shuffled to the door. When he opened it, he found Mara standing there, holding a folder. Her face was tired, drawn with worry, but there was a determination in her eyes that made Joseph pause. "Joseph, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What is it, Mara?" Joseph asked, his voice gravelly. He had heard the rumors, but he needed to hear the truth. Mara didn't hesitate. "It's the case. There's been a development. Halvers is being defended by the department, and they're pulling out all the stops. They've already started a smear campaign. They're saying that you were the one who provoked him, that you were resisting arrest, that you were aggressive." Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had known it was coming. The lies, the half-truths, the manipulation, but hearing it from Mara's mouth still hit him like a punch to the gut. "They're going to do everything they can to make sure he walks," Mara continued. "They're already talking about settling out of court. They think it'll blow over." Joseph's hand clenched into a fist. "No, I'm not going to let them get away with this." Mara nodded, a flicker of relief in her eyes. "That's what I needed to hear. We've been working on something. A few of your old colleagues, people who know you, who know what you've done for the law. They're willing to stand with you." Joseph looked at her, his heart heavy. "I don't know if it'll be enough, Mara. The system, it's built to protect itself. I'm just one man, and I've already been forgotten." Mara reached into the folder and handed him a stack of papers. "These are affidavits, former colleagues of yours, lawyers, judges, even a few people who worked under you during your time on the bench. They're willing to testify about the kind of man you are, about the work you've done, the cases you've fought. We can't just rely on the video. We need to show them who you really are." Joseph took the papers, his fingers brushing against the names of those who had been a part of his past. The weight of it all nearly overwhelmed him. He had spent his life fighting for justice. But in the end, it was going to be those very people who would decide whether he would have a chance at redemption, or if he would simply become another forgotten face in a system that never cared to. "Remember," he looked up at Mara. "I've seen this before. I've seen men like Halvers walk free. I've seen it 1,000 times. The system doesn't want change. It doesn't want to confront itself, and we're just the ones caught in the middle." Mara stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Then let's make them see it. Let's make them see that they can't just crush people like you. Not this time." Joseph nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if it would work. He wasn't sure if anything could work. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The weight of his years, of his career, had almost broken him. But now, as he looked at Mara, he realized something. He had fought for justice once before, and he could fight for it again. Joseph stood up straight, his back a little less bent, his gaze a little more focused. "All right, Mara, let's do this. Let's make sure they hear the truth." As the evening wore on, Joseph and Mara worked late into the night. The affidavits were carefully read and organized, each signature a small victory. The media was mobilizing, the protests were growing, and slowly but surely, the weight of the public's demand for justice began to shift the tide. The system that had trampled Joseph for so long was beginning to feel the pressure. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fight was just beginning, and Joseph knew it. The fight was for everything. The fight was for justice. The fight was for truth. And he wasn't about to let them bury it. Joseph Lowell had been a judge, but now he was something more. He was the voice of the voiceless. He was the man who would stand in the way of a broken system, no matter the cost. And the city, which had once turned its back on him, was about to see just who Joseph Lowell really was. The city had changed. There was no denying it. Where once there was a quiet, almost passive acceptance of the status quo, now there was fire. The protests were everywhere, their numbers growing daily. The once passive apathy was now replaced by a burning desire for accountability. Joseph Lowell's name had become a rallying cry. But it was more than just about one man anymore. It was about every black man, every woman, every person who had been subjugated to the whims of a system that treated them as invisible. Joseph had been the spark, but the fire that had spread was out of anyone's control. In the dim, fluorescent-lit halls of the precinct, Officer Darren Halvers had become a pariah. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. For the first time in his life, the very institution he had once served, his shield, his badge, had turned its back on him. He had become the story, not for his bravery or the work he had done to protect the city, but for a brutal assault on an elderly man. A judge. A man who had dedicated his life to ensuring justice was served. It had been days since the incident, and Halvers still hadn't been allowed to return to active duty. He was holed up in his apartment, watching the news, listening to the coverage, the swelling wave of public outrage over his actions. The faces in the crowd protesting outside, the faces calling for his head, were starting to take their toll on him. They weren't just protesters anymore. They were enemies. They were everywhere. Halvers knew what had happened. He knew how he had acted. The arrogance in his movements, the way he had shoved Joseph to the ground, the way he had justified it in his mind, convincing himself that it was just another black man who didn't understand the power he wielded. But now, in the silence of his apartment, it was all sinking in. He had been wrong, and the weight of that truth was heavier than any punishment the department could mete out. Joseph had heard from Mara again. The legal team had made significant headway with the case, but the longer Halvers remained out of sight, the more Joseph felt the pressure mounting. It wasn't enough to just hold the officer accountable anymore. It wasn't just about his bruises or his broken glasses. The system was flawed at its very core, and it needed to be exposed. Joseph had been to the protests. He had stood in the front lines as a symbol, but it felt strange to be there, to be seen as both the symbol and the man beneath it. The marches had become part of his life now, the signs, the chants, the voices that screamed for justice. He wasn't just part of the movement anymore, he was the movement. He had to be. His silence would be an endorsement of everything that had brought him here, everything that had been done to him. That was why, when Mara came to him with the latest update, his heart sank. "Joseph, it's getting ugly," she said, her voice thick with the weight of everything she had seen. "The department is spinning it. The media's already trying to paint you as a victim, but Halvers, they're trying to defend him. They're saying he was just following orders. They're saying you provoked him." The words didn't shock him, but they felt like a punch to the gut. "They're saying you provoked him." Joseph had seen this so many times before. It wasn't just about the officer's actions anymore. It was about the narrative. The system was already trying to make him the villain, to place the blame on him. After all, he was just an old black man who had resisted and provoked. They couldn't possibly believe that the real violence came from Halvers. That would mean acknowledging the racial bias that pervaded the entire system. It would mean acknowledging that Joseph had been attacked for being who he was, for being black. But the world was listening. It had no choice. The truth had already been set into motion, and it couldn't be stopped now. The streets were alive with the energy of people demanding accountability. People who had seen enough of this, enough of the systems that allowed people like Joseph to be treated as invisible. Back in the precinct, Halvers was being questioned again. This time, it wasn't just internal affairs. It wasn't just a routine inquiry. There was pressure now, heavy and undeniable. The public was watching. And while his colleagues pretended not to be nervous, there was a palpable shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. The higher-ups were scrambling to save face, to make it seem like this was just another isolated incident. But it wasn't. Not anymore. The very fact that the department had rallied behind Halvers in the first place spoke volumes about how deep the rot went. Inside the interrogation room, Halvers sat slumped in a chair, staring down at his hands. His uniform was still pressed, still neat, but he didn't feel like a cop anymore. He felt like a criminal. The familiar weight of the badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. "What happened that day, officer?" asked the detective sitting across from him. Her voice was cold, professional, but there was something else there, something else that made Halvers's stomach turn. He knew the game was up. "I was doing my job," Halvers muttered, his voice shaky. The man he was resisting. He didn't listen. He made a move toward me. "I had to act." "You had to act," the detective repeated slowly, her eyes narrowing. "You had to act. Against an elderly man who was unarmed, who wasn't even resisting arrest, who you didn't even recognize as a former federal judge." Halvers looked up sharply. His heart skipped a beat. How did she know? The detective leaned forward, pressing the issue. "Do you realize who he was, officer? The man you assaulted. He was Judge Joseph Lowell. He served on the bench for over 30 years. He helped shape the very system you claim to protect. Do you think he was some criminal on the street, just waiting to be treated like garbage?" Halvers swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He couldn't meet her eyes. The truth was choking him. "I didn't know," he whispered, barely audible. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," the detective replied, her voice hardening. "You didn't care who he was. You didn't care who anyone was. You didn't care about the law. You cared about power. And you thought you could get away with it because people like him." She gestured toward the folder in front of her, filled with the story of Joseph's life. "Don't matter to people like you." Halvers's face twisted in frustration, the pressure building inside him. "I was just doing my job. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't want to be disrespected." The detective didn't flinch. "Disrespected? You assaulted him. You didn't just lose control. You weaponized your power. And now you're going to answer for it." In that moment, Halvers felt it, the crushing reality of his own failure. This wasn't just about a poor decision or an unfortunate misunderstanding. This was about something deeper. It was about the fact that from the moment he had raised his hand against Joseph, the system had been exposed, the mask had fallen, and no amount of excuses would cover that up. Joseph stood at the window watching as the city moved below him. The noise of the protest was quieter now, but the energy was still there, thick in the air. He could feel it. He could feel the shift. The story had spread, and with it, the truth. The lies that had protected officers like Halvers, that had allowed them to act without consequence, were crumbling. People were starting to see it, starting to see the truth of what had been happening for years. But even as the city began to shift, Joseph knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The system would fight back. It would dig in its heels. It would try to bury him, to bury all of them. But for now, Joseph allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The storm was coming, but Joseph was ready. The city had become a battlefield. It wasn't the kind of battle where guns and violence raged in the streets, though the tension was thick enough to cut through the air. No, this battle was quieter, more insidious. It was a war of narratives, of power, of control, and at the center of it all stood Joseph Lowell, former federal judge, now the unwilling symbol of a broken system that had once claimed to uphold justice. Joseph had been prepared for this. He had spent a lifetime working within the law, his mind sharp with the understanding that every action, every choice, could either uphold the truth or distort it. But nothing had prepared him for the way the world had changed. The city had been on fire, the protests sweeping through every corner, and Joseph had become the spark that had ignited it. For once, people weren't just watching, they were listening. His name was on every street corner, in every broadcast. His face was on billboards, on flyers, in people's hands. Joseph Lowell, the man who had spent decades sentencing criminals, had now become the criminal. And the system he had fought for, the very system that had always promised justice, was now the very thing that sought to crush him. Joseph sat at his kitchen table, the same wooden table where his late wife used to sit with him in quiet reflection after a long day in the courtroom. The room felt colder now. The silence between him and the memories of her was louder than any words he could muster. The world outside was abuzz with the growing protests, but inside, he was alone with his thoughts, alone with the weight of what was to come. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. Joseph hesitated, then picked it up. "Mara?" "Yes, Joseph, it's happening." Her voice was tight, barely holding the words back. Joseph could feel the tension in the air before she even spoke it. "Talk to me," he said, his voice steady but strained. "It's the hearing. They've fast-tracked it. Halvers is going to testify, and we've got one chance to make it stick. The department's already trying to discredit everything. They're pushing the narrative that you resisted, that you provoked him." Joseph clenched his jaw, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty chair across from him. He hadn't expected anything else. The system didn't work for people like him. It never had. Halvers wasn't the problem. He was just a symptom of the larger disease that had festered for so long. But they couldn't bury the truth. Not this time. "They've also dug into your record," Mara continued, her voice tinged with frustration. "They're saying you're too old, that you're out of touch, trying to make it seem like you're just a disgruntled old man who's angry at the world." Joseph felt a cold anger rise within him. Out of touch. They had spent his whole life telling him he was too much of a threat, too educated, too principled, too determined. And now, when he was old and broken, they were trying to call him irrelevant. He was no longer a judge in their eyes. He was just another angry black man with a chip on his shoulder. But he had always known that wasn't who he was. Not to them. To them, he was simply a tool. A cog in a machine that existed to serve the few at the top. Joseph leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "We fight back. We fight back with everything we've got." Mara hesitated, then said softly, "Joseph, you've already lost so much. I just want to make sure you're ready for what comes next." Joseph's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The weight of the years was heavy on him, but he had seen this fight before. He had seen it from the other side of the bench. He had seen men and women destroyed by the very system they had believed in. But this time, he wasn't going to be the one who lost. "I've been ready for this my entire life," he said. "Let's take it to them." The courtroom was filled with an electric tension. The reporters were there in full force, cameras flashing, notepads furiously scribbling. The gallery was packed with people. Some came for the drama. Some came because they knew deep down that this trial wasn't just about a cop and a retired judge. It was about something bigger. It was about a system that had been broken for far too long. Joseph entered the courtroom slowly, his cane tapping against the floor. He didn't look at anyone as he made his way to the front. His steps were deliberate, each one a reminder that despite everything, he was still in control of his own destiny. He was still a man who had spent decades making decisions that changed lives. He was still the same man, even if they didn't want to remember it. Halvers sat across the room, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The officer, who had once been so sure of his own power, now seemed small and insignificant. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a noose around his neck. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Joseph's gaze. It was clear he knew what was coming. He knew the public outrage. He knew that the truth was starting to bubble to the surface, no matter how hard he tried to push it back down. The judge entered, an older man with greying hair and a stern look on his face. He gave a brief nod to Joseph, but his gaze lingered for only a moment before he addressed the room. "This is not just another case of police misconduct. This is not just a man against the system. This is about truth. This is about justice. We are here today because of a broken system that has allowed too many to fall through the cracks. We are here today because of an officer's actions and the consequences of those actions." Joseph's heart beat steadily as he rose to his feet. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, controlled, but filled with the weight of everything he had ever fought for. "I stand here today, not as a former judge, but as a man who has seen the worst of what happens when power is unchecked. I stand here today because I refuse to be invisible. I refuse to be another name forgotten in the shadows of a broken system. I refuse to let the man who assaulted me be the face of justice. Justice is not a tool to be wielded by those in power to keep others down. Justice is for everyone, and it is time for that truth to be heard. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. The officers in the room, the lawyers, the judge, they all sat in stunned silence, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the man they thought they could ignore wasn't so easy to dismiss. Joseph stood tall. The truth was out. There was no turning back now. The system had already been exposed for what it was. And in the end, it would be up to them to decide if they were ready to confront it. The courtroom's final moments were a blur. The testimony came fast, the evidence stacking up like bricks in a wall. The affidavits, the support from his colleagues, the growing number of people who had rallied behind Joseph. All of it added weight to his words. The case was clear. Officer Halvers had acted out of bias, out of an unchecked sense of superiority, and in doing so had broken the law that he had sworn to uphold. But there was something else in the air now. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It wasn't just about a cop's punishment. It was about the recognition of a man who had been silenced for too long. It was about the truth. When the verdict came down, it wasn't just Halvers who was convicted. It was the system itself. The judgment wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about everything. It was about all the men and women who had been crushed by the weight of a system built to serve the few at the top. It was about everyone who had been forced to live in the shadow of a broken justice system. The final gavel came down. The verdict was read. Joseph Lowell had won. But the fight was far from over. As Joseph left the courtroom, his cane tapping once more against the marble floor, he knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The city would change. The system would change. But it would take more than just a single case to fix the damage that had been done. It would take more than just one man to turn the tide. But Joseph had never been one to back down from a fight. And the fight had just begun. The streets were quieter now, the protests slowly tapering off, but the echoes remained. The tension that had gripped the city for so long hadn't dissipated. It had settled deep into the fabric of its being, into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded. Joseph Lowell's name was no longer just a headline. It had become a symbol. But what that symbol represented was still up for debate. Was it a symbol of justice, of victory, or of a system that had failed so many for so long? Joseph had won his case. The officer, Darren Halvers, had been convicted. The department had been forced to acknowledge the truth, to face the reality of the systemic racism and brutality that had festered within its ranks for years. But as Joseph stood before the cameras, giving his victory speech, there was no joy in his voice, no celebration, only a solemn reflection on what had been lost and what still needed to be done. "I stand here today," Joseph began, his voice steady, "not as a man seeking vengeance, but as a man who has spent his life fighting for something greater than myself. I've spent my career in a system that promised justice for all. But what we learned, what we all learned, is that justice isn't something that's guaranteed. It's something we have to fight for every single day." The cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes furiously, but Joseph's eyes weren't on them. His eyes were on the streets, on the faces of the people who had fought beside him, who had stood in the rain, in the heat, demanding something that should have been their right all along. He thought back to the moment when the officer had shoved him, the sound of his glasses shattering under Halver's boot, the feeling of being powerless in a world that had long disregarded his existence. He thought back to the quiet humiliation he had felt, the weight of being seen not as the man who had once shaped the law, but as just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, as he looked at the sea of faces in front of him, as he spoke to the world, he knew one thing. This victory was not just for him. It was for all of them, for every person who had ever been shoved aside, for every person who had ever been erased by the system. The victory was theirs, too. The next day, the media was still buzzing with coverage of the trial, but Joseph felt a gnawing emptiness inside. He had fought the fight. He had won the battle. But the war was far from over. As he sat in his modest apartment, watching the endless cycles of news coverage, A thought kept creeping into his mind. Had this really changed anything? The faces of the people who had once called him judge now whispered about him behind closed doors. He had received countless messages of support, but he had also received threats. The calls and emails that came in, the ones he deleted, those were the ones that burned with rage and hatred. Accusations that he had betrayed his people. Accusations that he had done the right thing, but not for the right reasons. The truth, as painful as it was that the world hadn't changed all that much. The system still stood. The same system that had allowed Halvers to commit his crime without thinking twice. The same system that had allowed him to get away with it for so long. The same system that would allow him to walk free, his life barely touched by the consequences of his actions. Joseph leaned back in his chair, his eyes falling on the corner of the room where his old judge's robe hung in a faded frame. It had been years since he'd worn it, but it still held a certain weight, a certain significance, and yet the robe now seemed like a distant memory, a reminder of a past that he couldn't reclaim. For all the change he had fought for all the battles he had won, there was still something bitter about this victory. It wasn't enough. He knew it. The world knew it. There were still men like Halvers in every corner of the system. There were still people who thought that black lives didn't matter. There were still people who saw Joseph not as a man, not as a judge, but as a problem, and they wouldn't stop until they had buried him and everyone else like him. But the phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. He recognized the number. It was Mara. He hadn't spoken to her in days, not since the trial. "Joseph," she said, her voice urgent. "We've been getting reports. There's another case, another incident. Same kind of thing. Only this time, the officer's name is already on the line. It's getting worse." Joseph's heart sank. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. But he already knew the answer. He had known it was coming. The system didn't change overnight. It didn't change with one trial. Not when the roots of it ran so deep. "We have to keep fighting," Mara said, her voice cracking just slightly. "It's the only way. If we don't stand up now, we'll be here again, in the same place." Joseph stood up, walking over to the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. It was beautiful, but it felt distant, like a world that was just beyond his reach. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's hard. I don't know how many more times I can keep doing this, how many more times I can walk into that courtroom and see the same faces, hear the same lies. I've been fighting my whole life, Mara, and sometimes I wonder if it's ever going to end." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence that held the weight of understanding. "You've already changed something, Joseph," Mara said softly. "You've made them see, and that's more than anyone else has done. They can't ignore us anymore." Joseph nodded, though it wasn't a comforting thought. It was the truth. But it was a truth that wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. And so, he did what he had done all his life. He decided to keep moving forward, because even though the system wasn't finished with him yet, and even though the weight of his history seemed to press harder with every day, Joseph knew one thing. This fight wasn't just about one victory. It wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had been silenced, forgotten, erased. He put on his coat, grabbed his cane, and walked to the door. There was more work to do, and he wasn't finished yet. The city outside was still in turmoil, but Joseph knew that as long as there were people who fought for justice, there would be hope. And no matter how many times they tried to break him, he would never stop fighting. The road ahead was long, and it was filled with pain and hardship. But Joseph Lowell had never backed down before, and now, with the fire of the people behind him, he was more than ready to face whatever came next. Because justice, true justice, had yet to be served, and Joseph Lowell was not about to let it slip away. Thank you for following this story to the end. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of the journey? Have you ever experienced racism or witnessed it in your life? Your experiences are incredibly important to us, and we truly value every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Your support means everything to us. Wishing you a great day ahead. And if you've listened all the way through, leave a comment with the phrase, "The fight for justice is never over," so we know you made it to the end.